Welcome back. I am your host, Ian Prize, and this is a sort of young person's guide to prog rock. We are continuing on to part 3 of Dark Side of the Moon with Any Color You Like.
Just the way it smoothly goes into the next song is a bit of album genius, I thought. You know, considering the next song's all that synth and thick layers of that, it just goes shoop, like a little slide just straight into it, as in a way that, it's incredible.
I mean, this album's tracking is obviously almost literally the best of all time.
You can definitely listen to all these songs on their own, and they're great songs on their own, but the way they transition is just
unbelievable.
Fantastic.
And I was going to say, and then the way they've placed the next song, Any Color You Like, right after. So it's a nice slow, you've mellowed out, and then they jam. And it actually, interestingly, gives you that breathing space. So the song itself is just breathe again.
A full step down.
Full step down, but then they just jam. But this is the genius of Pink Floyd. In fact, this is probably one of their greatest skills, is giving you breathing space.
Yeah. There's no jamming, though. Like, there's layers recorded here. You can't jam layers. You know what I mean? It's like...
Yeah.
That is a synth, another synth on top, another synth on top.
It's the illusion of jamming. Yeah.
But it's easy to listen to, but it's like this has been through the ringer in the studio.
Yep. They have thought it through.
There's loads of stuff going on, and it moves into different places. And it's not a song, is it? It's just sounds, but some good sounds.
Very good sounds.
Just that analog synth sound. It adds another bit of warmth into what could have been. The album could be so spacey and cold, but this makes sure that it doesn't ever go that way.
Sure, you feel like there's humans behind the desk now.
Exactly. That warm analog synth or that sax work or David's guitar work at certain points.
I always think, again, going straight to the solo, because it's the best bit, is that kind of every song on this album has got the Univibe pedal. So that's that swishy, roundy sound on the guitar. But in this one, he's using the thing that it's kind of based on, which is a Leslie speaker. So that's a spinning speaker. And it's got a fuzz pedal, it's got wah, and that all going at the same time. And to me, it sounds like Neil Young. Okay. You know, that kind of... that wobble he's got when he plays, that's just all heart, and he may play one note heart 1,000 times, he just plays the same note, but he does it with so much
zest.
Yeah, David does this so beautifully in this one, and again, it's the blues roots that he's diving into. But yeah, it does sound like a Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Neil Young solo, I think. Yeah, I absolutely love that little bit.
Yeah.
I think if there was going to be a flaw in this album, it could have been here if they indulged more. I mean, this is a 3-minute, 26-second song that, if this was, say, King Crimson, would be an 11-minute adaptation of a Polish composer's concerto that goes on forever. But keeping it tight, keeping it short, this is just another masterclass.
It is mercifully short.
Yeah.
It's exactly as much as you want, and then it ends.
No, and I was going to say, I think because they did it in 2 halves, where they kind of had the wiggity bit, and then they have the breakdown bit, and then they come back in with some analog synth. I think, again, 3 minutes and it's over, and that's the right amount of breathing space, but not just sitting around and staring at your toes.
Yeah. Did they ever have a goal for how long the whole album was supposed to be?
No, but I think, vinyl just means that you're going to roughly do 40 minutes. Maybe they could have done another 5-minute song or whatever, but I think, if you've done 40 minutes, you've kind of done your contractual obligation.
You filled the LP space.
Yeah.
It kind of captures the mood of the band for me. Like, they were having fun, and they were enjoying this creative process together. Otherwise, the song probably doesn't belong on here. It's just them sort of capturing something they got from a jam. And they were like, this jam was so much fun, it's so good, and we all liked it. Sure, we already got a song out of it in Breathe, but let's just also show the fun part, without any lyrics.
Totally agree with that.
And I also think keeping it funky, but a song we've already heard, is really nice. So we've heard Breathe, we love Breathe, and then you just do a funky version of Breathe. I think that you're trained to love this song.
Yeah, it gives that album a theme. If it didn't have one before, it's dragging those pieces together.
Yep. So we come then to Brain Damage. So Brain Damage is a Roger Waters basically folk composition, but of course it gets elevated to stratospheric levels. So I think this is Roger's first real meditation on outsiders. So obviously he famously wrote a little snippet here in Echoes, but here he is for real, talking about outsiders. Musically, you can hear the modulation. So modulation is just using chords outside of one key. So you hear these jazzy chords, you hear these lyrics about outsiders. All in all, it comes over to a really pleasing and unusual song. And actually, it's so unusual that I always forget the song exists. And it's a great song.
I really just view this and Eclipse as one song. I mean, obviously, this side of the album flows together very beautifully. But more so than anything else, like, this is really like part 1, part 2 in my mind.
Yeah.
And I would struggle to even describe what these two songs are. Like, I mean, what did you call it, Ian? Folk? Like, it doesn't sound like anything else that's come before or since, but I love it. Like, imagine if you put Brain Damage and Eclipse on as, hey, I like prog rock, listen to this song. Like, it would just be like taking someone to a different planet. But it wouldn't necessarily be a good introduction to prog, but it would, like, this just doesn't sound like anything you've ever heard before.
Yeah.
And imagine 73. Think about what was on the radio, what was popular at the time, and then this comes out.
Yeah, no, and I was going to say, I think the reason I say folk is you can hear kind of like a picking pattern. It kind of, if it had been just him and an acoustic guitar, you can hear the kind of mellowing out sitting in a meadow somewhere. But then it's a completely different song. And I think, you're right, like it is unusual. I don't feel I've ever heard a song like it again.
I completely agree with Brian. Like, Eclipse and Brain Damage together do feel as one. Like, they are. I see them as one as well. If we're naming favourite songs, this is my favourite song of the album.
Interesting, okay.
Probably always has been, because I just enjoy how masterfully it closes off the album. You've gone through this journey, and again, this, and then you reach Brain Damage and Eclipse. Yeah.
It's the thesis. And I was going to say, I think this is something I actually didn't get until maybe doing this podcast. Obviously, he's talking about a lunatic. Lunatic being super old-timey medical term for crazy person, and meaning that you were influenced by the moon.
I guess people still call each other fucking lunatics. Like,
well, no, you call each other a lunatic now,
insult.
but as in, like, I think back in the day it was a little diagnosis where it's like you've got...
Oh, I see, right. He doesn't have schizophrenia, he's a lunatic.
Yeah, you've got too much moon energy, and thus you're a lunatic. So yeah, I was going to say it's funny because in that sense it brings this side of the album certainly thematically together.
Even just the expression, like, a lunatic's on the grass, correct me if I'm wrong, but in, like, schools and universities, traditionally you weren't even supposed to, like, walk on the grass. Like, that was, like, a sacred thing. And I think, like, at Oxford and Cambridge, you had to be, like, a professor to be allowed to walk on the grass or something like that.
You still cannot. You have to be a fellow to walk on the grass in Cambridge and Oxford. So this is still true, and only lunatics can walk on. No, I mean, I think this is genuinely the point. Is it's saying, if you are apart from society in some way, 'tis you who walketh on the grass, and 'tis us who shake our fists.
Interesting.
Yeah, and the song probably never would have happened without the Syd Barrett tragedy.
Yeah,
and the fact that Waters keeps returning to this subject just shows you, like, how much it affected him.
Yeah.
And how much he missed his friend. And when you think about it in that context, the song is very sad, but the chorus is so rewarding, and, the wordplay is so great too. I'd say this is probably runner-up for his best lyrics.
Yeah.
So back to back, just knocking it out with some great lyrics. And just a fun, creative song. I mean, I guess fun is the wrong word, but it's just a really, really creative song, especially putting it at the end of the album. Is perfect album arrangement for me.
Yeah.
It's the massive dynamics again in this one. It's not just musical, it's like emotional dynamics. Going back to the Univibe thing, because it is, for me, that is the vibe of the album. Every song it's got this in. It's used slightly differently here. Just by notching the speed up slightly, it does conjure up a feeling of kind of that uneasiness, that kind of
like
paranoia,
insecurity.
and
Yeah.
it sort of gives you those vibes, and it goes from that to bliss is the only word to describe the other sound that this song has, and it kind of reminds me of, you know, like at the end of a musical.
Yeah.
You know, like you were saying how Brain Damage and Eclipse kind of become the same song. It's almost like Brain Damage is the song that is the end of this album, which is a musical. You know, the musical of something like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and then Eclipse is the goodbye and thank you for the fish.
Yeah. The actual walkout.
You know, the last listen of this, I didn't even register that I'd got onto Eclipse until it finished. I was like, oh, kind of expecting something else. I was like, oh, I just actually missed that. I was just zoned out for a minute. It was just over.
I mean, I was going to say... Yeah, I was going to say, I think, you know, what you're talking about with the dynamics of this song. So it's wonderful because there's the quiet picking part and then the exploding dam bursts thunder in your ear part, you know, with the swelling organs in the background, whatever. And then, of course, it just ends on the swelling organs. And so I think it is quite easy to miss the transition to the final song, which we will, I promise, talk about in a second. But does anyone else have thoughts about these lyrics or whatever? Because I was going to say there's something really beautiful about Roger saying, if all of this bad stuff happens, I will still see you on the dark side of the moon. And I was like, I actually like that you'll never walk alone kind of feeling. There's something really beautiful about that.
Yeah, and like I said, yeah, the chorus is very rewarding
Yep.
for the, you know, sort of somber mood of the verse. Yep. The chorus is very kind of uplifting with the way that the almost all the chords are major for like the main part of the chorus. So it's a very happy sounding part. It really puts the creative stamp on the tail end of this album. And especially the way that they transition it into the final song.
This is kind of where I get this idea about it being a musical of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's got that kind of, you know, you feel nice about the things that have been talked about here that are actually quite heavy. Yeah, it's like, don't worry, guys. You can still walk around in your pajamas and have a cup of tea. You know, it's all right.
But I think you are right, actually. You know, this flags up something else that I think Roger thinks he's being funny and witty.
Right.
Again, as we've talked about many times with Prog, it's not ha-ha. It's more like type of witty. But obviously, like, it's witty lyrics. And I think, you know, he's part of that British tradition of witticism. However, this is also very touching and moving lyrics. So,
but yeah, it has that typical dry British wit about, you know, in this case, mental health and is proper mental health.
What's proper society?
What is sane? What is insane? Honestly, not being overly preachy about it, though. And I think that's why it works. It could be just this dark dirge that you don't really want to be part of, but it has that dry British wit to it in a way that it is somewhat amusing.
Mm-hmm. So, just real quick, because you brought it up, a bit of trivia. Douglas Adams, author of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and Pink Floyd were buddies.
Huh.
And he got to join them on stage because he played guitar. So he actually joined them on stage.
Really?
No way.
Oh, shit.
A tiny trivia fact over.
I promise I didn't know that. That's so funny.
It's funny. I just read a factoid about him that his editor would lock him into a hotel room to finish his books because he was such a procrastinator.
Oh, fantastic. Also, so I got his short stories collection way back in the day. It was like short stories from his life. And one of them, and it always sticks in my head, and it's like the funniest anecdote I've heard by someone I've never met. So he was on a train, and he bought himself like a packet of potato chips. And he puts the packet on the table, and the guy sitting next to him reaches across, opens the packet, takes a chip. Then he's like, okay, well, this is weird. So he just scoots the package back, eats a chip, and then the guy across from him scoots the package, eats a chip. So they go through the bag of chips, and then at the very end, the guy takes the bag of chips and leaves the train carriage. Then Douglas gets up to leave and realizes his bag of chips was in his lap the whole time. And he was like, the thing that's always tickled me is that for all of these years, there's been some guy wandering Britain who has the exact same story but doesn't have a punchline. So anyways,
That's kind of a double punchline story.
I was going to say
good.
that's genuinely one of my favorite anecdotes, as I say, from someone I don't know personally.
That is hilarious. And it's so believable, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fabulous. So that was your Douglas Adams anecdote for the evening.
Yeah.
So we've just... Oh, we haven't been brain damaged. Oh, dear. So that was most of Dark Side of the Moon, and then we walk out to literally the best album closer that there could ever be, Eclipse. And it's just a 1-minute organ walk down that somehow continues to swell and swell and swell and swell. It is, as I said, probably literally the best album closer you could have. It's just a song written to close an album.
They stuck the landing. I mean, couldn't agree more. I don't think you can end an album more triumphantly and conclusively than this. But again, it's only 2 minutes long. And that I think that's including the fade out, so that the music is, as you said, Ian, just like 1 minute. This could be a 14-minute droner, but...
A 1-minute end. Yep.
Tight. Yeah. Perfect.
Yep. Like literally a swell.
Yeah.
Yep. And I was going to say, this is kind of the song equivalent of Sgt. Pepper's giant E chord at the end. Whereas like it is just an, as you guys say, it's an exclamation point. It just says, this is the end, except it's 2 minutes long. But it's that same thing.
That's funny you should say that, because I was going to come in hot saying exactly that.
Yeah.
And I was ready to defend it to the end, but we already agree.
But everyone agrees, yeah.
There's something in storytelling, and I think this is why everyone's so salty about Game of Thrones, even though 70% of it was great. But you're always going to remember it as not fulfilling on its promise if it has a bad ending.
Yeah.
And there have been so many albums that are on the popular side, but bands front-loading their albums and then just blowing off the second half or even like the second quarter of the album. It's like, okay, these were always going to be B-sides.
Yeah.
And I've never enjoyed that. I think your last song, you got to leave a lasting impression. And this is a lasting impression.
For the ages.
For the ages.
Yep.
Yeah, hey, yeah.
For the ages. Yep.
Yeah, right.
I am 100% with you on that. So the only other kind of thing I had about this song that was, in, I guess, musical theory-ish sense, I loved the monotonal, meditative nature of the song. It reminded me of Tomorrow Never Knows.
Oh, interesting. I never would have made that connection.
Because it's the all that you touch, all that you see. Obviously, changes the notes.
Yeah.
But
you can't only hit one
but
note.
I mean, but they basically feels like they're basically hitting one note, because the verse doesn't have a lot of dynamics in a melodic sense. They're just chanting basically at the end, and then it's just building, and obviously it just does it for 1 straight minute. Perfect. A to B.
Yeah, and this, I guess, again reinforces the theory that this side of the album is about the things in life.
Yeah.
Because literally this is just a list of things in life.
Yeah. So we end on the heartbeat drum kicking, and then Jerry O'Driscoll. There is no Dark Side of the Moon, really. In fact, there's Nazis building a base on the back of it.
It's funny, like, how many themes there are that run through this. Like the voiceovers, you've got the heartbeat, you've got the univibe swelly guitar thing. There's so many things that are consistent from track to track that tie it all together that, you feel like you're part of an in-joke.
There's that meme where, and this is a lot of what most people experience when they do an English degree or even just do it at GCSEs or whatever, whereby subtext is found within literature that wasn't actually put in there by the author, right?
Yeah.
This is a question for all 5 of you, really. Do you think all of the subtext in these tracks
For this album specifically, they did actually plan this as a concept. So they sat down and legitimately did this is going to be the bit about money. This is going to be a bit about war. This is going to be the bit about religion. So they actually had mapped out this specific album as a concept album, and then Roger filled in the lyrics. I think for the most part, when people do concept albums, they actually just stumble into it. I think actually what makes Pink Floyd interesting is I think they're probably one of the most intentional concept artists.
I was going to say, even if you have intentionally done that, there will then be other bits of subtext that, like Rufus is talking about, that someone in school might ask you to look into. Now, I think those elements are not necessarily on purpose.
Exactly, yeah.
I think those are just the character of the songwriter coming through and what they just happened to be going through in their life at that time, personally.
Yeah, I would agree. And again, not to overly simplify it, but the themes they're trying to express to me, anyone can pick up, which is why I also think this is like mainstream prog. It's like the only mainstream prog. It's very obvious to know what the song Money is about. Us and Them, pretty clear. What do you think Time's about?
Uh-oh, these songs are supposed to be about something? We might have to start back at the top.
But I just think it's that accessibility that has turned this relatively small prog rock band into the stratosphere. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Ian, after this, they are basically on the same level as Led Zeppelin, The Who. They are A-list rock stars at this point.
I mean, this goes on to be the 18th best-selling album of all time, I believe, and only leaves the top 100 charts, I believe, in the 80s. So it is I think the longest continuously on the charts. So yeah, I mean, this is like a monster album, and then they obviously go on to be a monster band. And they'll repeat this level of success with The Wall. So, I mean, they're at that stratospheric level of, legend. And then I also think the other thing that makes this album specifically magical is the tension between the plannedness and then obviously such a huge dose of spontaneity. So, like famously the breakdown for Money, they just were like, oh, let's just do this breakdown. I think The Voices was just this random element that they threw in. And then the fact that all four of them got involved in the songwriting spices up the songwriting a bunch too. So I think you actually have a bunch of spontaneity, and the sound effects, all that sort of stuff. So I think it's structure, plus interestingness.
Yeah. I think if you spend enough hours in a studio with the equipment, all that spontaneity, having someone to know, that's a good bit of spontaneity. That's
and that's bad spontaneity, yeah.
Yeah, that's a problem we need to overcome. When people talk about the muse, that's what the muse is. That's you spending the time.
Yeah, to sift the wheat from the chaff. Yeah.
Yeah, you've done the graft. If there's someone else there who's good at that, separating the wheat from the chaff, who's usually the producer. Yeah. How good your producer is the person who is able to get the best bits out of someone who's put the work in, basically. Yeah.
Alan Parsons has an interesting legacy here because I think its success and the tight production of it can be credited to Alan Parsons. But from my understanding, the band members actually don't like how much credit Alan Parsons has gotten from this. And they think he's indulged and overrepresented his role in making this album. So as far as I know, I don't think he ever had any other involvement in Pink Floyd after this, as far as I know.
So he goes on after this to do the Alan Parsons Project. Yep.
Yes.
So I obviously wasn't there, so I'll never know how much he. Yeah.
Whoa, Ian.
Big reveal. I saved this for the end, so I wasn't there at the recording of this. No, I mean I have heard of this controversy. Obviously, Pink Floyd themselves will go on to produce their next 3 or 4, and then actually David Gilmour will produce. So they produce their next 6 albums. They are credited as producers. The production thing's a really interesting beast. So obviously the producer chooses a lot of arrangement stuff or helps kind of promote a lot of arrangement things. In addition to working with the engineers on literally getting a technical product. So they are recording an instrument, getting the tape, mixing the tape together and stuff. So the producer works with the band, with physical tape engineers, with the studio technicians in general. Maybe you're managing the band themselves and various egos, blah, 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 blah. So they're in a very weird position. So I obviously don't know the division of labor of how that all worked. So did the band already know how they would produce this album? Did Alan Parsons help with the technical problem? I mean, I was going to say, I think the one thing, irregardless of who did what and when, the one really obvious credit to Alan Parsons, whether or not he did it physically himself or was the spiritual catalyst or whatever, their albums right before this are very muddy relative to this album.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that was him, if he pushed them there, if he did it himself, if he mixed it, blah, 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 blah. Doesn't matter. His presence on this album correlates with a clarity of sound that Pink Floyd will bring to the next album.
Interesting.
It's funny you mentioned that because production-wise, I actually feel like Wish You Were Here feels like Dark Side Part 2 and how clean that is, and how evenly separated the instruments are. Even though, like, thematically and musically, it is very different. It's very much of the exact same era. Versus, like you said before, it's kind of that the production, I think, before this is actually pretty poor. As much as I love albums like Metal, the production is not very good. It is muddy. Yeah.
I can't imagine the album without him because I think he brings like the backing vocals. I wouldn't be surprised if he, brought in the saxophone. At the very least, he distilled the band's creative vision perfectly.
Yeah.
You need the person in between the band's willingness to be creative, take risks, but you need somebody to be like, hey, but we do need to keep this on the rails a little bit.
Yeah.
And I imagine that he contributed to that in some way. The band, they have discipline and restraint, but I wouldn't be surprised if Alan Parsons was sort of the voice of reason when the band was trying to take risks.
As I say, at very least, I suspect he stood between Roger and David and reasoned between the two of them. So I guess my final few thoughts on Dark Side of the Moon, to synthesize everything we've talked about, I think the three real big elements that make this album successful, I would have said, A, less is more. So they left a lot of space, both musically and within the music. So they got tight and loose when they needed to do either one. They got jazzy, so they didn't go for the obvious thing every time. So they would do interesting transitions, interesting chord progressions, but never King Crimson off the deep end. And they involved extra people and obviously used each of the band members to their fullest. And I feel like those three elements, if you just do those three, you too could write your own Dark Side of the Moon. But yeah, I would say those are my three kind of final reasons to why I think this album works as well as it does.
Okay, so responding to the first point of less is more, yeah, it's funny to say less is more because if we were not musicians, I don't know if I would say that because of all of the creative collective that goes into this album. But in terms of leaving space for stuff, I think you're absolutely right that less is more. And it's almost like a narrative structure where you got to have valleys so that you can have peaks in terms of levels of excitement or engagement. And Pink Floyd nails the valleys, and that makes their peaks that much more enjoyable.
I mean, I think it's exactly what you said. Even within a song about verses and choruses, they do a great version of soft, big, soft, big. So I think, yeah, they definitely nail that.
I apologize to the audience for constantly reminding them that we're musicians. Sorry, I don't know. I feel like sometimes that context is necessary.
Actually, genuinely, I was going to say, I think the one part that truly informs, in terms of like the less is more, and I actually talked about this on Metal, David Gilmour's secret power is that he plays like one note a measure. And if you've never played guitar, it's unbelievably hard to just do that and not just want to like rip a crazy solo.
Right.
Or, like I'm just going to shred endlessly. And I think, again, this is true for Rick Wright, just letting some chords just like hang. I do think it is a nice perspective. If you have played music, you will understand that they are using less, but using it judiciously. And like the actually shaving away of stuff, especially if you're good and you are able to solo and stuff like that, it is actually powerful to shave away stuff. As you say, it creates the valleys that the peaks look greater from.
Yeah. Pink Floyd, for all of their talents, they show remarkable restraint.
Yeah. Get jazzy, don't go for the obvious.
So in terms of getting jazzy, I can think of many times throughout this conversation that I have said that they took a risk and it paid off.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what getting jazzy is you swing for the fences and you just keep knocking it out of the park.
Yeah.
And
Yep. And that's what this album is.
yeah, I don't think there's any other way to put it.
Maybe that is my unified field theory on this one, is that there's enough outside influence on this to completely prevent anyone from jumping up their own ass at this point. There's enough checks and balances that keep everybody in check and everybody contributing the same amount. And it works perfectly, and they'll never do it quite this well again. Even though I still love Wish You Were Here sometimes more than this, it's not the same. This is the perfect balance.
Yeah.
Genuinely, before doing this podcast, I never thought of them as a prog band. Never. It didn't even cross my mind that it would be considered a prog genre. But I didn't know that much about prog rock. It really didn't. And I get it now, but I still feel like this isn't the same as any of the other bands that we've talked about. This is a band that's still steeped in the roots music of the past. There's the blues element, there's the theatrical feel of the whole thing. The subject matter of the songs is very different. It's just so different to everything else in prog. Obviously, this is progressive music, but
it ain't prog rock.
It ain't prog rock.
I completely agree with you, Ed. And I hate to say it, I think maybe part of the reason I don't consider them orthodox prog is maybe they're too successful. I feel like there's a little bit about prog rock is the nerds. They're never, quite reach the heights of other bands.
Yep. And this is the one.
We were talking about what, if you look at this era, what they usually wore on stage was just plain black t-shirt. And they look really cool. They also look weirdly contemporary. Like you could pluck them off the stage and it would work now. While, Rick Wakeman is wearing a golden cape. But at the same time, while this is, I think you could argue the height of Pink Floyd, I still think my favorite album is the one that follows, Wish You Were Here. Well, I use this in my personal life all the time. I'm a real beer nerd, and people ask me, where you're from, what's the best brewery? And I'll say, well, I think Fremont in Seattle is the best brewery. But my favorite is a much smaller brewery called Structures. In the same way, the best Pink Floyd album is Dark Side of the Moon, but my favorite is Wish You Were Here.
No, I'd say that's very much the feeling I've had. There's been times, obviously, where Dark Side has been my favorite at that time, but I've cycled probably between Wish You Were Here, Animals, The Wall for a hot second, and Metal. And I've cycled between all 5 of them as my favorite, but Dark Side is the best, one of the best albums of all time. It's my ideal of what an album is. And I think if you said, what's a rock album, I would just say it's Dark Side. Give me solos, give me that perfect album structure, give me those lyrics, and give me an iconic album cover. It's the album.
I think Genesis sort of were able to reach that similar height, but they had to, shed their prog weight.
So, this is one of the interesting things about Pink Floyd's lasting success. So the gents over at Progressive Palaver had always said that Pink Floyd's on a trajectory, and I love this way of thinking about it, where it's from Metal to The Wall, they're on a trajectory. And my read on what that trajectory is more Roger and less Rick. And we'll talk about that in more detail later, but that's my trajectory on what that looks like, is just more Roger, less Rick. And that's the flavor you're getting of more wordy, more concept-y, and less musical. But it's a very straight line. And so I think you just get a compounding interest of success. So even if Dark Side is the best Pink Floyd ever did, that success would lead them to success with Wish You Were Here, and then Animals, and then monster success with The Wall.
Yeah.
Even if they're not necessarily the best album of all time, I think they just kept hitting home runs. Whereas I think Yes actually did have pretty good success with Fragile, then good success with Close to the Edge, and then went on a roller coaster of adventures. Same with Genesis, where I think they had some prog success. Then they dipped down for a little bit of Phil Collins, then built up to a massive 80s with Phil Collins.
Yeah.
So I think other bands kind of
did it in different
wax
ways.
And wane.
Yeah.
Yeah, whereas I think Pink Floyd and, the Beatles are the other really good example of this, where it's a straight line from Love Me Do to Abbey Road, and it's just pretty much a straight shot of success. And it's unbelievably rare that any band ever does this.
One thing I just wanted to bring up lastly was it's amazing that they were able to create such a good album, even though clearly there were tensions between Waters and Gilmour already.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're able to keep doing that for another 2-3 albums as well, or whatever.
Yeah, it's mad, isn't it?
I mean, we're going to talk about this at length on The Wall.
Yeah.
This is something that eats Pink Floyd up, but never destroys them completely until The Wall.
Yeah. They just work through it. It's really impressive.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, isn't it? It's that they've worked through it. They are like pros. Yeah. They've just dealt with the adversity and just carried on. Other egos wouldn't have survived that, and we wouldn't have the great albums that come out of that.
So obviously they're scrappy young kids trying to make it throughout the 60s and 70s. Then they make it here. I think on a personal level, after this, you take separate limos to the stadium. I think right. Nick Mason even talks about Roger Waters still being his closest friend, even by the time of Animals and The Wall. But I think there is an element of, by the time you're at that point, you're not a Four Musketeers situation. You are just four rock stars showing up. You know, and then at some point you're like, we should probably come up with another album. And I think the lack of group engagement is what gives you something like The Wall, where it's a Roger Waters solo effort. Just the lack of group engagement from the massive success just tends to eat bands alive. So, sweet dreams!
The one other thing about Pink Floyd, I think other prog rocks don't have is, correct me if I'm wrong, but after obviously Syd Barrett, you have the four, and there's never really any other composition of the band. Like, they lose members, but they never bring anyone else in. And it has sort of that Beatles, like, there's the Sacred Four.
Yeah.
And no other version is ever really Pink Floyd. Mm-hmm. I mean, they filled in for people, right, when the band broke up in the 80s and stuff, but there was never really, like, new members of Pink Floyd.
No, you're entirely right. I think as you flag up there, and as I talked about with this being a moment where they use all of the bandmates to their absolute best. No, I think that's how this works, is I think if you have four people and they all do something and you notice them changing, I think that does create a classic band type of thing. And I think this is the thing about Yes. And I think it probably spills over into stuff like the songwriting, the song quality, the album construction. I think if you have the instability of band members coming and going, I think it creates a lot of personal uncertainty in addition to artistic uncertainty. So you're always learning how a new drummer works or how a new keyboardist works. Then you're not just building on a sound, you're creating a feeling of uncertainty. I mean, and King Crimson's by far the worst example of this, where you're scared of the new version of King Crimson every album. And then also, I think, we who have talked about them know and love Martin Barre in Jethro Tull. But I think there's also these bands where it's like it's the Ian Anderson experience, and the other guys can just rotate. And then you kind of don't care. You're like, okay, it's Ian Anderson who just happens to be called Jethro Tull. And I do think that also gives you less of a personal attachment. So I think there's that. So I was going to say, I guess my final point is to get really, really trippy about the whole thing. We're looking back now on our 3 hours of Dark Side of the Moon chat. And it's so crazy to me. This is, the most legendary album, maybe of all time. It's legendary. And as a band, you don't know you're making your Dark Side of the Moon. I think that thought always has just blown my mind. Like, in 1972, they've just finished their classic album, Obscured by Clouds. They go into the studio with 10 random-ass songs, start recording some crazy interviews, say, hey, my buddy who plays sax, hey, Alan Parsons' friend who sings, come on in. And at the end of the day, you are holding the prism in your hand, and you're like, oh my God, I recorded Dark Side of the Moon. That blows my mind.
So I think that David Gilmour said this in the documentary about the making of this album, that he said that when he was making it, he sensed that they were making something special, but he wishes that he could have listened to it for the first time. And that kind of irony, I think, is deep and profound.
And it's very profound, yeah.
And, I mean, you get a sense that you're making something good, but you never get to experience it like everybody else can. So you'll never know if you're making something that's going to be great or not. You don't go about creating, like, the next best album.
It's just your next album, yeah.
You know? You just love what you're doing and hope that everybody else loves it as well.
And we do.
And we do.
Any final thoughts about Dark Side of the Moon?
When I signed on to do this podcast, this was the album I was looking forward to talking about the most. But I think throughout the process of recording, I've enjoyed exploring new albums more. But I will talk to anybody about this album at any time. It's one of my favorites for a reason. And, you know, as someone listening to this podcast, hopefully you have a love in your heart for this album as well.
It would be very weird if you were listening to this whole podcast series and
you got to the end and be like, wow, those guys love Dark Side of the Moon. What losers.
Okay, fabulous. So that was Pink Floyd's 1973 classic, Dark Side of the Moon. Thank you all so much for coming on that journey. This has been a sort of young person's guide to prog rock. I have been your host, Ian Prize. I want to thank my guests.
Thanks for having me, Ian.
Thank you, Sir Ian.
And we'll see you on the dark side of the moon.
And we'll see you on the dark side of the moon, which is on our Instagram at progfrogpod and our email at helloprogfrog@gmail.com if you have any longer thoughts, questions, or queries. So unfortunately for Pink Floyd, this was their high point and the last time they had any fun making music together. So Dark Side of the Moon was an enormous success, as I had referenced earlier, and they had to ask, what does this actually all mean for us? And they answer that with Wish You Were Here. But next week, whilst we have ascended to the commercial and critical heights of prog rock, we now get to drive right over the cliff, and we start our series on the 1970s prog rock bands reaching their final form and final destination. So next week, join us as we revisit the beating heart of prog and ask, what did in fact happen to the other 8 carnivals in EOP's Brain Salad Surgery?
If anything, I feel like you're more likely to get snagged up in it with a dangly white coat on. Surely it's more of a hindrance than anything.